important points I was able to share. And now the next topic is the Four Noble Truths. Okay, so this was just a brief kind of easing you into how all this connects. So it's part of the study of the Perfectional Wisdom Sutras, which are usually studied for 6 years, based on not the Perfectional Wisdom Sutras directly, because those are difficult to understand, but we take a commentary by Maitreya called The Ornament for Clear Realizations, and in that text, which consists of 8 chapters, 8 chapters laying forth or revealing one of 8 paths, and then more extensively 70 topics. Okay, so I just gave you that brief explanation. It was very brief, I admit, but the Four Noble Truths are so vast that I'd rather go into the Four Noble Truths more quickly. And as part of the introduction, you could just read from page 1 to page 8. I said previously maybe page 4, but no, it's actually all the way up to page 8. Okay, so this gives you a good introduction, and I don't think it's necessary for this. It's very technical, and if you're interested, you're welcome to read this. Okay, any questions? No? Okay. Now, and then when you see on page 8, of course, the Four Noble Truths, they're all cited. Why they're called noble, why they're truth, that will be explained more towards the end. Okay, there'll be an explanation on that. But first of all, to say something about the material on the Four Noble Truths. Now, at the very end, I've used, I don't know exactly remember what page, anyway, the page numbers are different, but so on page 126, okay, so there's already one part, there's one part on page 126 that is starts with a particular text that we studied before. It's called Decisive Analysis. So 126, one text called Decisive Analysis, and then another text called The General Meaning. The general meaning and the decisive analysis. So it starts on page 115. It says the presentation of the Four Noble Truths according to the general meaning. You can see on page 115, the very last sentence on page 115. And then you also have the presentation of the Four Noble Truths according to the decisive analysis on page 126. So the way we studied the Four Noble Truths in the context of the study that I just explained, the way it was explained was first according to a text called The General Meaning by a great Tibetan philosopher or Tibetan master called Benshin Sonadapa. He's mentioned here, and when you get to it, it'll be repeated. We'll speak about it again. So anyway, this particular text just gives you a general outline of the Four Noble Truths. What are the definition, just some kind of general information. And then on page 126, the second text called the Decisive Analysis starts debating, starts analyzing, gives you a good sense of like what are the definitions. Like previously was a definition given in the general meaning. That is just a general kind of overview over each of the truths, like a general definition. But then to be more precise, and then the kind of debates that could arise if you say this is the definition, this is another, this is not the definition, and so forth. So general kind of debates issue forth from the second text. So, but this text, you can actually only go through these debates if you understand the Four Noble Truths thoroughly. So therefore, I've added everything I could find on the Four Noble Truths to starting from page 9 to 114. So usually the most extensive explanation you find on the Four Noble Truths is in the Lamrim. So the Lamrim Chemo by Lama Tsongkhapa. Then there are briefer kind of versions of the Lamrim. So this is a genre of texts very popular in the Tibetan tradition, introduced in the Tibetan tradition by a great Indian master called Atisha. He introduced this particular genre of teachings, which is called Lamrim, or the graduated stages of the path to enlightenment. So the Four Noble Truths are very extensively explained in there. And I've basically just collected everything together and gave an extensive explanation, because in order to then come to the general meaning and the decisive analysis, to really understand and be able to go through these discussions, you need a good kind of basis. Okay? So this is really basically everything I know about the Four Noble Truths. I mean, this is kind of like I tried to summarize it into those few lines. And honestly, I was thinking, when I read through it again, I was thinking, whoa, this is pretty pessimistic. It starts off really pessimistic. So bear with me. It's pretty much heavy on suffering initially. Okay? So if you know this, if you're prepared to hear about this, and I'd say a few words why this is necessary anyway, you don't listen with this kind of, oh no, more suffering? But this is like so extensive, like so many different levels here. But we'll discuss all this, and we'll speak about this in more detail. But it's not about being pessimistic here. The idea is being realistic. Just being realistic. And that serves, I can see 3 types of purpose here. Being realistic. Understanding our situation serves the purpose of just being realistic and being prepared. Secondly, maybe generating the wish to do something about it, to overcome those problems. And thirdly, to generate compassion for others experiencing the same problems, because what is described here is true for ourselves and for everyone else on this planet. Okay, all right. Anyway, so just for you to be prepared. But talking about these 4 noble truths, the word noble is really not my favorite word. It actually doesn't translate as noble so much, but this is like one of the translations. I'm not gonna do anything about it. It's so popular. I mean, widely known as the 4 noble truths. Though nowadays the word that translates as noble actually doesn't translate as noble. It actually means Arya, like Arya, or super mundane. Arya actually in Tibetan means someone who's not just worldly and ordinary and just acts according to their own whims, whatever, negative emotion arises, acting accordingly. No. It means someone who goes beyond the ordinary, the worldly. So, of course, the word Arya has been terribly misused. I mean, in Germany about 70, 60 years ago. No, actually, it's a Sanskrit word which means someone who's just not ordinary. He doesn't go according to ordinary kind of worldly perceptions, but goes beyond, looks beyond, basically. So that's called an Arya person or an Arya. And then you have truth, those 4 truths, which were seen by someone who is extraordinary. So basically, the 4 noble truths translates as 4 facts that someone who's gone beyond the ordinary has seen to be true. Okay? Now, what you should be doing right away, go, oh, I'm not sure those are truth. I'm not sure they're facts. So right away, when I ask you to be very skeptical, to be very critical, that should be, oh, let's see, right? Okay, they say that, those Aryas, whoever they are, but let's see whether that's an actual truth. And this meaning of for truth of suffering and so forth, it'll be explained again in the general meaning, but just since they're recited in the beginning, so etymologically it just means extraordinary people found this to be true. So let's see, okay? And the first one starts with a very pessimistic name, the truth of suffering. Okay, suffering. Now, suffering, I think, is really misunderstood. It's widely misunderstood. Okay? Because suffering, and it's very natural that we do misunderstand the idea of suffering, because we're not necessarily familiar enough with our own mind. Put it in that way. Suffering. If I were to ask you, what do you think is suffering? Right? Give me an example of something that is suffering. What is suffering? Okay, that's a very good answer. Absolutely. Anything that came to mind before you became a Buddhist? Frustration. Okay. Anyone losing your job? Anyone? I mean, I'm saying that because oftentimes when I ask this question, and right now the answers were very much, well, death, even birth and death. Actually, birth and death are not suffering, to be totally precise. Birth and death are not suffering. Aging is not suffering. Frustration is. Losing your job is not. Okay? Yeah. Because death is not a state of mind. Birth is not a state of mind. Aging is not a state of mind. Suffering is actually a state of mind. Losing your job is not a state of mind. Losing your job is also not suffering. Because if it was suffering, everyone would suffer if they lose their job. But, depending on what job it was, some people may be very pleased. Right? So, even death is not suffering, because some people die very happily. Pardon? Really? Really? Yeah, I would say so. Well, I mean, how do you know the planet is round? So someone told you? No, I'm kidding. Because, well, people talk about it like people who had a near-death experience, who say then, well, they're not scared of death. They look forward to their own death. Whether that's really the case, okay, is to be seen. But at least great practitioners, like great Dharma practitioners, they see their own death as an opportunity to practice. Right? So, of course, in the end, you're right. I don't know, because I don't remember my last death. I don't remember last week what I did, so not surprising. But the point is that, I mean, from accounts of people, there's some people who don't seem to be scared, and great practitioners see this as a wonderful opportunity to use their own death to progress on the path. Okay? All right. But then likewise, birth. In the West in particular, we don't associate birth with suffering. No, we do, but we still see it as a very positive kind of, something very positive, right? I mean, death is something very negative, birth is seen as something very positive, so to associate birth with suffering. Anyway, aging likewise. I mean, some people like to grow older. They look better than before, so they don't really, Anyway, so, but the point is here, like I said, yes, frustration is actually a mental state. So suffering is a mental state. That's the whole point. Sometimes we give the name of the cause to the result. No. We give the name of the result to the... No, we give the name of the result to the cause. That's it, yeah. So, for example, losing your job can become a cause of suffering. Cause of worry, cause of frustration, cause of sadness, etc. But really, suffering is a state of mind. That's it. It's a state of mind. Okay? So whatever happens outside of ourselves, and again, see at your own experience. Suffering is an interpretation of what has happened. Right? This is the beauty of it, because if we interpret a situation which we would potentially see as negative, as something challenging, as something, oh, I could do something with it, it actually can become such. Now, of course, we need to differentiate between two types of suffering. One is physical and one is mental. Okay? So, physical pain, for example. When we talk about suffering as mental, we speak in particular of a specific type of mental state called feeling. So, in other words, suffering is a type of feeling. It is described often as a mental factor, which a lot of people struggle a lot with, this idea of mental factor. What does this actually mean? We're talking about a consciousness and awareness? Yes, we do. Yes, we do. But consciousness and awareness is also a very difficult idea. And the way I like to look at it, consciousness is an agent. Does everyone know the word agent? What's the Hebrew word for agent? Okay, so that one. An agent. An agent is something which does something. Something that is active, that does something. And it has two aspects to it. It is something that does something. One way in which it does something is that it does something with something. It has an object, in other words. So it always has an object. A consciousness is an experiencer. It's an experiencer or a perceiver of something. There's always something that is perceived. So it's impossible to have a consciousness that does not have an object. Now, if you were to say, well, sometimes I think of nothing. Well, there you go. Nothingness is your object, right? I mean, if it's not a tree or a house or tomorrow or yesterday, what you're thinking of, well, it may just be nothingness. That's still an object. And your mind does something with that. So usually it perceives the object. It perceives it. It is aware of it. That's the kind of basis function every awareness has. Every awareness is aware, is conscious of something. Okay? So every consciousness, and the object also appears to it. That it's like an appearance of the object. It appears in a way like our mind serves like a mirror. Okay? So of course the objects that you see right now, they're far away from you. So obviously if I see you right now, you're not in my brain. It's not like you enter me. No, you're appearing to me. You're appearing, of course, to my eyes. When you say something, that appears to my ears. Okay, those are just the means to the kind of intermediate, the intermediate kind of factors that allow me to then consciously or with my consciousness, be aware of the sound, be aware of the sight, and so forth. So they appear to my consciousness, and I perceive them. That's the basic function of every consciousness. So it does something with the object, in the sense that the consciousness is an agent which does something with the consciousness, which in general is being aware of the object. That's the basic function. But then it can do more than that, depending on the type of consciousness. So the basic awareness factor is true for any type of consciousness, but the sense consciousnesses are a little limited in that all they can do is just register what goes on around them. But the sense consciousnesses, they do not categorize, they do not judge, they do not, analyze, they do not examine. So the 5 sense consciousnesses, all they do is pretty much be aware of what's going on around, in a limited fashion, of course. We can't see what's going on behind our head and can't pick up all the sounds, but we pick up quite a few things in our environment. And then the mental consciousness takes that information passed on by the sense consciousnesses and it classifies, examines, analyzes, and so forth. So it performs even more of a function than the sense consciousnesses. It can take it deeper. Okay? So that's important or helpful to understand about consciousness as in being an agent that does something with an object. Always there's an object. Okay. But when I say the mind can do things with its object, well, it can do things with its object because it has specific functions. It performs certain functions, just as a car can do all sorts of different things, right? As a car being an agent in a sense, like something that does something, and therefore performing different functions, and each of those functions are called factors, car factors if you like. So the same is true for consciousness. It has an object, and depending on the mental factors, it is able to do all sorts of different things with its object. So different functions. So factor is just another word for function. It performs different functions. The consciousness can do certain things. So one of the functions is, for example, discernment, or discrimination as it's also called. A particular function that the mind can discern. I mean, we're able, mentally, to focus on one thing as opposed to something else, right? We can zoom into one thing, discern that from something else, and just keep focused on that. So that is because of the function of discernment or discrimination. There's the function of attention. We can remain with one object over an extended period of time because it takes a while for us to be able to do something with an object. Just a few seconds may not be sufficient. So we can focus on one particular object for, let's say, a minute. Okay? So that is due to the function of attention. So I don't need to go through all these different functions, but this is just what the mind does naturally. It stays focused on the object, it can discern, so each mind has one of those functions. But one function that also comes along is the function of feeling. Every time there's an awareness, there's an experiencer, there's also a feeling. A pleasant, an unpleasant, or a neutral feeling. So sometimes we say, but I don't feel anything when I perceive this table. Well, that's called a neutral feeling. So it's like, it's neither pleasant nor unpleasant, so it's neutral. So that's when we usually say, I don't feel anything, there's no pleasure or displeasure. But the point is that every time we experience something, every time we see something, we hear something, we smell something, there's either a sense of pleasure associated with that particular consciousness, displeasure, or just a neutral feeling. Okay? So I don't know which one it is for you, but if there's a particular beautiful table, right, and you see this table, there may be a sense of pleasure. Or if it's a terribly ugly table and this is going to be your new table, there may be a sense of displeasure. So depending on what it is, there's just emotions arising all the time. Feelings like pleasant, okay. So those are really important. Those are the driving force in our life. Those are the driving forces in our lives. Because we like one over the other, obviously. Don't need to say that. So there's one we particularly crave, and depending on the object, which provides that particular pleasant feeling, the one that we crave, well, then we crave the object. We're very interesting that way. We don't realize that it's not the object that is the pleasure. It is actually the feeling of pleasure itself. But since we can't differentiate, or even if we can, we believe that this object is able to provide this pleasure at all times, we crave the object. Okay? All right, so feeling, that's very important. Now, what are we supposed to feel? We're supposed to feel happy. Seriously, we're supposed to feel happy. Now, some people may say, oh no, it's good to suffer. It's good to suffer sometimes because it helps us to grow. Yeah, all right. You know, it's good to suffer in order to have more happiness later. So we use suffering temporarily, but actually just to have more happiness in the future. It's a bit like exercising. You know, you're not doing it for the pain. You're doing it in order to later on feel better physically. So basically, seriously, from a Buddhist point of view, we're not supposed to suffer. We're not supposed to. It's not natural. We do, of course, have displeasant, unpleasant experiences and so forth. Even neutral ones. Even those ones we're not supposed to have. Not even neutral ones. We're supposed to be happy. It is in the nature of our mind to be happy. We're supposed to, in the nature, as in like the actual nature, the actual way it should be to be happy. Okay? Does that make sense? And that's why we want it. It's deeply, it's like every living being wants to be happy. That's what we're supposed to be like. We're supposed to be happy. It's just a waste of time, our suffering.
Wants to be happy is not the same as it's in our nature.
Want to be happy because this is the actual natural state. This is how it should be. So I would say there's a cause-effect relationship in the sense that we're supposed to be happy. It's in the nature to be happy, and that's why we wish for it. It can go to the degree of craving, but just wishing for it, there's nothing wrong with it. And everyone is supposed to be happy. And everyone has the right to be happy. I would say that's the most basic Buddhist principle.
It's easy for us, for our own experience, to know that we want to be happy, but it's not obvious that it's in our nature.
No, not yet. We just started the retreat. No, I'm just claiming this. I'm glad you have that critical mind totally. But no, we're just starting. Why is it in the nature to be happy? Well, this is to be seen. I'm just making a claim here. Yeah? Okay, but good point. So it's not obvious, no. But I'm setting forth these claims and then we'll go through them as we progress. Now, that's why the Buddha starts with suffering. Because he's basically saying, we're experiencing something that should not be. Okay? We're experiencing something that should not be. But then you could argue, well, why does he mention it then? We know. We know this already, and we don't want it, so he doesn't have to mention it. But the funny thing is, we're aware of certain types of sufferings, but we're not aware of all types. Right? We're not aware of all types. We have a great talent to shut out anything that we find unpleasant. Oh, I don't like to think about it. It makes me not feel good. So we just shut it away. But that's not a solution to a problem. It's like a sick person ignoring their symptoms. Oh, yeah, I have these symptoms, but I don't want to think about it. It makes me feel unwell. But the Buddha is saying, well, first we need to recognize these symptoms. So suffering is just a symptom, actually. Suffering is just a symptom. So we need to recognize these symptoms because we don't want to suffer and we'll continue and there'll be more possibly. So let's recognize the symptoms first without ignoring them because we're so good at ignoring things. Okay? So that's why I started off with this. So it's not about being pessimistic, it's just about being realistic. Okay? All right. Now, as I said, basically, so this is what it says at the very beginning when we talk about suffering, or dukkha, as it's called in Sanskrit, it is actually just a mental factor. It's a state of mind. Suffering is a state of mind. Okay. So, therefore, when we speak about suffering, there's a difference between suffering and the first of the truth. A truth of suffering and a suffering are not the same. A suffering is a mental state, a feeling, a particular mental state called a feeling. A truth of suffering is much more pervasive. So the truth of suffering, it's really funny. I mean, if I say, for example, my body is a truth of suffering, we don't talk like that. So this is a little unusual. The way we use the word truth. We don't say my nose is a truth. Okay? But this is how the word is used. It's just a matter of getting used to it a little bit. Saying that my nose is actually a truth of suffering. My mind, all my mind, not just my feeling, is a truth of suffering. It's just a matter of getting used to it. It's not a truth as such, but it is part of this category, truth of suffering. Okay? So just that you know the difference. Truth versus truth of suffering. Whatever is the suffering is a truth of suffering. Whatever is a truth of suffering is not a suffering. Because suffering is feeling. Right? Feeling. Okay. So that's important. Just a feeling. It's just a particular type of awareness. Yes?
Please explain it again.
Yes, I will. Well, I will anyway as we go along. So suffering in particular means a mental state, a feeling. Suffering is just a feeling. Truth of suffering is something that gives rise to that feeling. To make it a little bit more precise. So a truth of suffering, and this needs more explanation, but the truth of suffering is anything that can give rise to a suffering, that holds the potential to create suffering. Okay? So truth of suffering can mean the suffering itself or something that gives rise to it. And we'll speak about this. Of course, this is only at the very beginning, so what is the definition, why that is the case? So slowly I'll give you more explanation on that. Okay? All right. So, when the Buddha said, therefore, a truth of suffering, he was saying, we experience what is called a truth of suffering. So, our present mind and body. So, if you want to describe, if I ask you, who are you? Okay? The best way to say is my main ingredient is my mind and body. We consist of a mind and body. That's it. As a person, right? Okay, so what are you as a person? Well, there's a mind and then there's a body. That very much summons it up from a Buddhist point of view. Right? There's no explanation of a soul or, anything separate. There are different types of awarenesses, experiences, consciousness that change all the time, that reside in a physical entity that changes all the time. That's basically who we are. Okay? So there's the mental, therefore, and there's the physical. So that summons it up. But this mind and this body, the Buddha says, are a truth of suffering. They're a truth of suffering. They're not suffering. They are a truth of suffering. So, what does that mean? With this present mind and body, it's a truth of suffering because with this mind and body, the potential to experience actual suffering is always there. Does that make sense? This body, and we'll go through all the details, terribly vulnerable. So vulnerable. Yeah. So however healthy we are right now, however flexible we are right now, however much energy we have right now, the point is right now. We all know it can change very quickly.